I feel like I've been putting you off, but to be fair, I never had any intention to revisit you. I mean, come on. Last time I played you, I was 20. And I was still working at GameStop. Still wasting money on things and people that weren't worth it. It's funny to think about. Back then, I was in the know for just about every nerdy thing that was coming out. And I guess I always wanted to have a setup like people I used to watch on the internet. And when I found out that you were coming out with a fancy collector's edition, I just knew I had to have you. And it was easy to make choices like that. I used to be in that I can buy whatever I want with my money phase. And looking back, that set me up for some bad spending habits that I guess I'm still growing out of. Either way, I couldn't wait for you to come out. I was so excited. But then the reviews started coming in and they said that you were terrible and that you weren't worth the money. I just remember thinking, how could that be? You were the go-to for a challenging experience for the longest time. We had only just gotten Dark Souls to start breaking into the mainstream and, you know, just, you were the guy. So I ignored those reviews like everybody does on the internet, followed through, bought you, and played you. I was shocked because you really were bad. I was so disappointed. I didn't know what happened, but I soldiered on and finished you for the experience. Then I put you away and forgot about you. And then they started advertising for Razor's Edge when the Wii U came out, and I just didn't care because I didn't want to get burned again. So that was it. That was the last time I thought about you. I hadn't played Ninja Gaiden since. Until this year, that is, when I started re-experiencing the games a whole decade after I put you down just to remember what made you great. And I decided not to revisit you, but the Razor's Edge version that I have never experienced, so that I could say that it was somewhat fresh. But I'm done putting you off. Come on, let's go.
This is the beginning of the end of the world.
Alright, so before I start dissecting the story, because that's really the biggest thing to talk about with this game, there's a bit of behind the scenes history that I just recently started researching and learning for myself, so I kind of want to talk about it because it's kind of nutty. But the main thing is that Tecmo and Tomonobu Itagaki, the director of the series since the 2004 reboot, started having a little bit of friction after Ninja Gaiden 2 came out. Not everything is directly related, but a lot of his trouble started with some sexual assault allegations and eventually ended in him resigning from the company, citing pay disputes over previous releases' royalties. He went on to form his own studio, but depending on who you ask, he didn't quit, he was fired. That's neither here nor there though for this, because the point is that he wasn't around to shepherd the series anymore. That responsibility got left to one Yosuke Hayashi, who, if you don't know that name, he was the director of 2010's Metroid Other M. And as soon as I found that out, I knew what happened with this game. Hayashi stated in interviews that he intended to focus more on the narrative, something that wasn't considered a strong suit of the previous games, while making the gameplay more accessible to casual audiences that were looking for more than just crushing but satisfying gameplay. The intention was to humanize Ryu Hayabusa to make for a more interesting hero, while simultaneously trying to use this new side of him to establish a more interesting story overall. The gameplay, meanwhile, saw significant changes to the formula to streamline it while attempting to maintain some form of challenge. And I can state to you, here and now, this was a mistake. That little bit of background info isn't as much as I tried to make it seem like before, but I'm gonna go ahead and get into the story now because there's a lot to talk about. I won't really try to focus too hard on any changes between the game's two versions though, because it's actually been so long since I played the vanilla game that I don't really know too many minute differences between them, but the story is pretty much the same, so...
So, this is the beginning of the end of the world.
It all begins when Ryu Hayabusa gets a visit from some members of the Japanese Ministry of Defense, a man named Ishigami and a woman named Mizuki McLeod. Has a weirdly English name, any relation to Fox. They come to the Hayabusa village looking for Ryu because a terrorist group took over the Prime Minister's residence in London and took a bunch of hostages. Ryu, sitting there in his Sunday robes, asks what we're all thinking. Why is this my problem? Well, supposedly, it's his problem because these terrorists have threatened to kill the hostages if Ryu isn't brought to them. And I must have just set a personal record because I didn't didn't think I'd get through the first cutscene without having a handful of questions, such as, why is Ryu inclined to care about this situation? I don't recall the Hayabusa clan actually caring about situations outside of the village. Every other situation we played through in the series was kickstarted by way of their village getting sacked for world-ending plot stuff. I'm sure Ryu's a nice guy, but there's no investment in this situation for him at face value. Second, why London? Since when is Ryu involved in international politics? Why didn't they just attack somewhere in Japan? At least that's a little closer to home. Third, why didn't they contact Ryu directly? They clearly knew enough about Ryu, right? Knowing about his existence alone should be enough, I think. Given that he's from a secretive ninja clan, that should imply that they could find a way to get in touch with him without resorting to sending a messenger. But whatever, theatrics, I suppose, right? Fourth, why is this guy Ishigami acting like they have literally anything in terms of assistance to offer Ryu? Because he legit tells him, we don't need your help, you need ours. I'm gonna be honest, Ishi, I don't think you have anything to offer Ryu except an Uber to London. I can go on and on, but lastly, why is a Ninja Gaiden game making me ask this many questions in the first cutscene? But whatever, it turns out Ryu is indeed a nice enough guy to help out, but by the time he makes it into the building, he runs into this fancy looking asshole just in time to watch him kill the last of the hostages. Ryu asks who he is, but this theater curtain with a sword knows we don't really care about that, so he just starts fighting. When Ryu goes in for the finish, he gets a curse put on him by the sentient bathrobe that makes his dragon sword disintegrate and bind to his arm, leaving him writhing in pain. This curse is called the Grip of Murder and forces Ryu to feel all the pain the dragon sword has inflicted. But this guy in the royal carpet getup frames it as just the people that he's killed. Barely any of this is explained at this point, so I'm skipping a little ahead, but this is the inciting incident that forces Ryu on the journey he takes through this game. I also took the time to explain that because I already have another gripe with the story. It is trying, I say again, trying to say that the story's foremost thread is about Ryu battling with his path in life and agonizing over whether or not he's an evil person, since this curse's end comes when Ryu's life does. That's the game's aforementioned method of humanizing Ryu to make for a more interesting character, but that doesn't really work for me when you also portray Ryu as primarily focused on chasing this guy known as the Regent of the Mask and his group around the world to stop their super vague plot, since after this mission ends in them bombing the Prime Minister's place, while some Emperor Palpatine type watches on speaking all cryptic like, directly after they threaten to do the same all over the world if their demands aren't met in 7 days, because religious themes on top of everything else. Ryu barely even cares about what's going on because his only real goal after this is track the guy down and figure out how to break the curse. Not because he feels guilty, but because he'd rather not get unalived just because his arm now looks like it's made of jerky. Now that we're past the first chapter, they track the transmission down to the deserts of Saudi Arabia, so Ryu attempts to infiltrate their stronghold. Since he doesn't have his trusty dragon sword anymore, thanks to it now being corned beef hash smeared all over his arm, he's given this high-tech bow by Mizuki. What's so high-tech, you ask? It has aimbot. It takes one fight for the game to say, this is kinda lame, so Ayane shows up right away to bring Ryu the Jinran Maru, a loner sword from Hayate, and anybody who hasn't played Dead or Alive is immediately like, who? And that makes another problem for me, because I didn't know upon first playing this story that I was stepping into the fucking Tecmo cinematic universe where I need to play every game they dropped at this point, including their horny waifu fighter, just so I can be like, Also, in the original Ninja Gaiden 3, Ayane disappears like she was one of the Elder Gods in Mortal Kombat Armageddon and is never heard from again. So to fix that, they added filler missions with her later in the game, just like in the other re-releases, but it doesn't matter in the grand scheme because she's just there. Who? And they do that to a lot of the supporting cast. Not that they were given much attention before, but here it just feels like they were there to try and make this story feel less isolated, which, by the way, it's incredible that they pulled that off given that we're traveling around the world in this game. But there I go again, getting off track because the game is doing too much too early. This is the beginning of the second chapter, need I remind you? Anywho, you proceed to climb this skyscraper, fighting soldiers, helicopters, and wizards, alchemists, to find the guy who put the curse on you, just for him to taunt you about the curse before revealing, lol, he's a hologram, and he just wanted to mess with you before he leaves you to fight, surprise, a bigger helicopter. After destroying it and heading back to the base, you get another thread to this plot involving Mizuki, this middle-aged My Chemical Romance fan named Cliff, and this little girl Kana. They introduce them early on and build up to this connection that I'll just tell you now to save time. Mizuki's sister Saya and Cliff's brother Theodore were married and had Kana, but they died a year prior to the story, so she's left a traumatized mute that Mizuki takes in as a surrogate surrogate daughter. Meanwhile, Cliff is just there as the how do you do fellow kids kind of uncle and awkward brother-in-law. And the game jams this whole extended family drama on you in between missions via cutscenes. Getting back to that whole end of the world deal though, they track the baddies down to a jungle lab where they're cloning dinosaurs, making chimeras, the usual mad science stuff. Unfortunately, Mizuki and Kana are kidnapped, forcing Ryu to surrender, and he gets captured. He quickly manages to escape, but not before they get a hold of his DNA for their experiments. And the Regent escapes again after transforming his subordinate into a monster for you to fight using this egg of the goddess that's incomplete, but they figure Ryu's dragon ninja blood should help with that. Ryu takes it on, saves Mizuki and Kana, and escapes the wreckage of the lab to continue chasing down the Regent and his group, now known as the Lords of Alchemy, LOA for short. The rest of the story just goes on like this for a while, asking you to chase the masquerade ball mannequin and the LOA to stop them before either they succeed or Ryu dies. And now, in between all the terrorism, international military ego clashes where they sit around telling Ryu that he's a relic of a bygone era like they're not getting outdone by a wizard.
An alchemist.
I don't care, shut up. Ryu has to face his own mortality with all the emotional depth of an angsty plank, while we're supposed to now care about this anime Cabbage Patch Kid's backstory, even though we've only seen her in like 2 or 3 scenes so far. And she doesn't speak unless she's writing things out on her phone, and what is this? Not only is she asking a dude she just met to protect my mommy and later on to be my daddy, and expecting us to find that heartwarming for some reason, or believable that this is becoming some sort of emotional attachment for Ryu. This game was made in 2012. Who was out here using touchscreen phones with touch-tone keyboard schemes? Why did that just make me like her less? Why are you like this? Whatever, don't answer that. Moving on, Ryu decides to head back to the Hayabusa village to pick up the Blade of the Archfiend, the sword that was used by the late Genshin from the second game, who Ryu defeated. He also meets with Momiji and his dad, Joe, to consult him about the Grip of Murder curse, which results in Joe waxing poetic about the sins of the Hayabusa clan and how he doesn't know how to break the curse. So this trip is only productive in the sense that we got a better sword for the trouble and now we can use our 2 loners as a duel set. Back on the LOA's trail, Cliff informs everyone that he somehow got the location of an LOA base in Antarctica and he wants to accompany Ryu there because he's, quote, the best fit for this mission, whatever that means. And no one questions how he managed to get that info, least of all Ryu, who's busy bonding with Kana because she made him an origami shuriken. Cliff drops off Ryu in the Arctic as he charges headlong into their hideout to find a clone of himself. Since the LOA got a hold of Ryu's DNA at an earlier point, we're now out here fighting doppelgangers. Nice. After defeating it, Ryu's curse starts acting up when, surprise, Cliff shows up along with the old guy from that one scene in the beginning. His name is Ashtier, and he does the super obvious thing where he reveals that Cliff works for him because of course he does. Not only that, but he's Cliff's grandfather and therefore Kana's great-grandfather. And familial ties be damned, they want to use Kana for their experiments, which has seen accelerated progress thanks to Ryu's DNA. And they also kidnapped Kana again, off screen. Oh my. Then Ryu has to go for a round 2 with the clone, which got transformed by Ashtier into some weird meat monster form. But after he beats it, he escapes the facility and runs into Ishigami, who's been radio silent since pretty much the beginning, in the mountains. They regroup and he explains that he was suspicious of Cliff and went underground so that he could figure them out in an attempt to protect Mizuki and Kana because he was cool with Mizuki and Saya's dad back in the day. He came back into the picture because he learned that Kana was taken to a ship called the Black Narwhal, which mid-conversation gets sighted in waters halfway across the world. They explain this in one of Irane's filler missions as Irene from the second game helping to find the location of the boat, but whatever. This wasn't in the original version, we're just gonna roll with it. So they decide to pull a bunch of Top Gun bullshit with Ryu jumping between 2 jets in order to get across the world to make it to this ship. One jet is piloted by this guy who's a cameo from one of the original Ninja Gaiden games, and the second one is piloted by Mizuki. The Black Narwhal is in the middle of a fleet of a bunch of warships, so Mizuki doesn't manage to drop him off on the Black Narwhal, but he makes it onto one of the ships and he begins working from ship to ship until he gets to the Black Narwhal, all the while fighting a bunch of soldiers, some spider tanks, and eventually fighting Ashtier, who pilots this dragon megazord that's made up of the previously defeated spider tanks, because why not at this point? Ryu gets to the center of the Black Narwhal where Kana's inside another egg of the goddess and ends up in yet another fight with the Phantom of the Opera's extravagant cousin. But Ryu wins this time and slices off his mask, learning that, surprise again, that's Theodore, Kana's dad, brought back from the dead by Cliff, who was the actual mastermind behind Kana's parents' death, and mind-controlled with that mask to do his bidding. And unfortunately, Kana just watched Ryu cut down her dad, and despite being right there to hear the whole conversation, she finally finds her voice, and the only thing she cares to do is call Ryua In a weakened state, Cliff pulls up to Ryu and pulls the dragon sword straight out of his chest while leaving him still cursed. Awful convenient for Cliff, and uses it along with Kana's body as a catalyst to bring life to this giant goddess they've created. It begins rampaging, sinking the ship in the process. Ryu has a nightmare where Genshin passes his sword to Ryu, which I guess is meaningful, but all we really get to unpack is that like the sword has lightning now, so I guess it's more powerful. Ryu wakes up on another ship looking worse for wear because the curse is reaching all the way up to his face now, and it turns out Mizuki found him and fished him out of the ocean. And after all that mid-mission bonding, Mizuki starts getting all cutesy awkward about how she's glad that he's safe. Also because Kana said off screen that she thought they'd be a happy family or whatever, so I guess Mizuki has been daydreaming about it now that the world is about to end. They follow Kana back to Japan where she's wrecking Tokyo. Ryu begins making his way to her, but the curse is finally catching up to him when he gets swarmed. Joe and Momiji show up to cover for him, and Momiji passes him the Eye of the Dragon before he takes off. Ryu also runs into Muramasa, who reassures him that the dragon sword is said to be unable to kill those that aren't evil, and also,
I made a promise to protect you and Kana.
which is whatever to me at this point because I've already been rolling my eyes at the dialogue in this game every few minutes. Mizuki shows up and gets Ryu that much closer to Kana when Cliff shows up and once again tries to convince us that he's threatening. Meanwhile, I'm just watching this man bluster to us in that fucking beanie and I can't help but feel like no one has ever taken him serious at any point in his life. Once again, because we haven't been getting enough last minute exposition, he tells us that Kana's mom Saya was originally supposed to be the catalyst for the goddess, but she backed out because she wasn't insane, got married and had a baby instead. So Cliff had Kana's parents killed and set her up to be their new goddess. After which he releases his inner Machamp and tries to fight Ryu. To be honest, in my eyes, he's really dumb looking, but at least he got rid of the beanie. Ryu almost wins the fight, but his curse has impeccable timing and puts him out of commission for the rest of the fight. Right when all seems lost, in swoops good old Teddy for the dramatic save and
Oh no, he's hot!
but before Cliff dies, his last words are that the only way he can save Kana is to kill Kana because killing the goddess will result in her death. Cliff gets Thanos, and Ryu and Teddy decide to team up and get the rest of the way to Kana. But because things haven't been dragged on long enough, Teddy decides at the 11th of 11th hours that he can't risk you possibly killing Kana and squares up for one last duel. Ryu finally lands a killing blow on Teddy, but it turns out that Teddy planned this anyway. With his dying breath, Teddy says that this was the only way to free Ryu of the grip of murder and releases him from the curse. His dying wish being to save Kana, he passes on, and Ryu, at last cured of the grip of murder, looks down at his one-time enemy and removes his mask before jumping into one last fight. Back to full strength and now with his ultimate Ninpo, the True Inferno, he confronts the goddess and ends up destroying the blade of the Archfiend in the battle, but just in time to retrieve the dragon sword. He goes in for the final blow and they decide to tease that Ryu might have killed Kana, but just immediately backpedal on that and show her reforming out of the goddess's body, and Ryu saves her and leaves her on the ground for Mizuki to find her. Right before he leaves, Ishigami finds him and sees him off by saying that he may not be a hero, but he's no cold-blooded murderer, and thanks him for saving the girls. Ryu silently nods and takes off. Kana wakes up and says that she wanted to see Ryu one last time to apologize to him for saying mean things to him, to which Ishigami and Mizuki say that he'll always be there to protect them. The scene cuts to one last shot of Ryu looking down at them right before taking off, jumping across rooftops like as if this was the end of Sonic Adventure, and closing out the story of Ninja Gaiden 3. I am just exhausted. I'm not gonna keep stating the obvious at this point, but the story is easily one of the worst parts of the entire experience. There are parts that could have easily made for a better story if they had focused on that thread instead of making this hodgepodge of moral pondering, unnecessary world building, and ineffectual attempts at emotional investment. I think the angle of Ryu contemplating the weight of his actions could have been interesting if that had been established as something that was part of his character in earlier games, but he's always been this stoic man of few words who had no qualms about doing what needed to be done to stop evil people from threatening the world. We all know he's not just some killer, just a man devoted to his duty, and this painful attempt at an emotional attachment to people he just met suffers for those reasons too. He's got people who's been in his life way longer that he barely shows any emotion toward at any point, even in this game. Sure, she's kinda cute and her story is tragic, but I think it's a stretch that just because of that Ryu would ever consider being somebody's stepdaddy. Also, come on, Mizuki's cute, but Momiji is right there! It just goes to show you that sometimes keeping things simple is a virtue. These games always knew what they were about, and they succeeded for it. The second they tried to do more, the whole game just lost the plot, because the series was never hyper-fixated on the plot. It's totally gratuitous and unnecessary. I suppose it could have been worse, because for all that griping, it's only a roughly 5 to 6 hour game, but I do feel like it was exacerbated by the actual game part of it.
So, this is the beginning of the end of the world.
I remember Ninja Gaiden 3 being a real chore to play. The vanilla version was so neutered, with the difficulty feeling replaced by enemies with cheap tactics, reduced options in combat, such as only having one Ninpo that was basically just a screen nuke kind of attack, less weapons, uninteresting enemy types replacing staple enemies that were actually challenging instead of cheap, no healing items, buckets of blood yet no dismemberments for reasons, etc. It felt like Ninja Gaiden developed by people who had no clue what Ninja Gaiden was supposed to feel like. It was disappointing and it made it harder to play, which I think also soured my opinions on the story back then because I felt like it just wasn't worth struggling through it, even though I did it. Technically speaking, the game is still comparable to the other games in how it runs. It's still running at a buttery smooth frame rate, the controls are still tight and responsive. The issue back then was that a lot of the enemies were designed with a different type of combat in mind. So many enemies were incredibly defensive or armored, with later enemies powering through your moves or taking advantage of distance to cheese you with ranged attacks. Coupled with the aforementioned lack of healing options, it wasn't even as satisfying to kill them due to things like obliteration techniques being missing and the overall defensive style the game tried to strong arm you into embracing, just ruining the flow. That's largely fixed in Razor's Edge, but in a way that feels like they sort of threw together better elements of past games, like painting the exterior of an abandoned house and doing little else before putting it on the market at the price of a new one. You can still feel this game's problems baked deep into it, but the things that were added kind of make it easier to take as a whole, if only a little. And they definitely did some more with some of the original ideas of this game, for which I can give some credit. First things first, they added in the majority of Ryu's armory from the previous games, as well as multiple Ninpo attacks for this one, which immediately increases the variety in combat. They still have all the cheap enemies, but they added in enemies from the previous games, particularly fiends that were entirely absent from the previous version. That is nice, but being that all the cheesy enemies still exist, you'll still find your fair share of annoyances. Personally, with my vague recollection of the original version, I thought I'd get through hard mode no problem since the second game was so much easier than the first. That was a mistake on my part. It is infinitely more frustrating and cheesy, but I still made it through, so I wouldn't recommend that personally, but running it back on normal to get this footage, the challenge is sufficient for a casual run. Again, 6-hour game, so you won't be here forever. I advise not looking for more, otherwise you're asking for more reasons to hate this game. Next, they added back the missing dismemberments and obliteration techniques. They're soaked in blood as opposed to the purple and green sprays from the second game, so it feels more brutal, which I'd say offers a certain sense of satisfaction when you push past all the frustration, but those little improvements feel offset by, as I said before, some other problems that were just baked into the game's DNA. As I mentioned a couple of times already, there are no healing items. That design choice alone is what makes the fights in this game so much more difficult, because you have to be better at fighting when you have every opportunity to get wrecked in a tense situation, but next to no opportunities to save yourself from it. As a matter of fact, the only way to heal mid-battle is Ninpo, because Ninpo recovers health based on how much damage is dealt. So you end up hoarding it for when you're getting mobbed, not to mention that you can totally whiff it sometimes and get nothing for it, and there are also no items for recovering Ninpo as in previous games, so you can only build it up in combat, which forces you to be more offensive when the game was clearly built in a way that forces you to stop being so reckless despite the changes. Thankfully, checkpoints are frequent, and between fights you might run into these hawks that act as save points that also give you a full heal like dragon statues from the second game. Shame you can't save these for later though, especially as you may have times where you don't need them as bad, but that's just another way the game is. The last big noticeable change is that for reasons I've been stating ad nauseum, there is no shop in this game. Whether you play well or terribly, you earn karma points returning from the first game, but this time they serve as experience for a skill tree kind of menu where you spend them on weapons, Ninpo, and health upgrades. At least there's a quick option for that, but I feel like there was no need for the removal of Muramasa's shop, which only makes me saltier that he shows up at the 11th hour and has nothing to offer but pep talk. Thanks, old timer. It's also got too many random quick time events for my liking. Alternating buttons to climb a wall with kunais was cool the first time, but it gets old really fast. And I'm already mashing buttons to do combos, so stopping me in the middle of said combo to mash a button just to do the steal on bone attacks that equal insta-kills is just making me spend more time on these fights that I'm already trying to get through. I'm honestly glad this kind of thing is something that we've moved on from games as a whole largely. I say all that to say that fundamentally, the game is still not anywhere near as great as its predecessors, but an attempt was made here that makes the trials you have to go through somewhat more bearable. But while I can appreciate a concerted effort to improve a flawed gameplay experience, it still bears the weight of a significantly lesser experience from its betters, but at least it looks pretty good.
So, this is the beginning of the end of the world.
Probably the main thing about this game that needed little changes was this game's style. It definitely has something different about it, but it's still largely recognizable as Ninja Gaiden at face value. It's still fast and somewhat flashy. It's still fluid. It's definitely showing its age, but this was a pretty damn good looking game back in 2012. Things like Ryu's model constantly looking more disfigured as the story progressed, and his curse got worse was pretty cool. The moments where you watched him fly through the air just to catch himself on an enemy right before cutting said enemy in half was pretty epic to see. Even if I got tired of doing it every other mission, there was a lot of environments in the game, even if they weren't incredibly detailed. Traveling from cities to deserts to jungles, the Arctic to labs to boats back to cities, it's pretty varied for a game that felt like it was trying things in all the wrong places. The voice acting across the board wasn't particularly strong, but I appreciate some of the efforts. They do just have a lot of soldiers running around with like bad English accents screaming F-bombs all day though. I think this is one of the first times I heard Troy Baker as a voice actor being the new voice for Ryu, and he's a top shelf VA these days, so that's something at the very least. Razor's Edge also went the extra mile to illustrate how the grip of murder was destroying him from the inside out, having these seemingly random scripted moments where his arm started to glow and it transported him to this ethereal realm, presumably his inner domain, where enemies he's defeated come back from the dead to get one more crack at him. That's actually doing a lot of heavy lifting for the idea as a whole. If the game as a package matched some of the effort seen in this department, I might have an entirely higher opinion of the game. It does get a little goofy though when you spend half the time fighting humans and end up fighting random fiends where they're clearly just slapped in. That and the spider tanks plus the spider megazord thing later on, but whatever. This game clearly wasn't batting 1,000. The music is also largely forgettable. There's really not much to say there. After all the generic butt rock in the fights to all the generic orchestral music and the dramatic moments, there's only 2 tracks that stick out to me. The song from Battles with the Region of the Mask and the main theme. It's actually pretty good. And you know they thought so too because they used it for the title screen and it's the song that closes out the game when the credits roll. It's probably the only song I remembered from any of the trilogy soundtracks going back in, and I guess that stands for something. I don't hate this game as I hated the original version, which is really surprising for me. I don't really love it either though. It still lands a little flat, especially after playing it immediately following the other games. But a decade later, I think I'm pleased to see that, well, they tried harder when they re-released this game. However, I definitely don't need to play it again. I'm good on what Razor's Edge offered over the vanilla version of Ninja Gaiden 3, and I think it'll be a while before I catch myself wanting this kind of game again, but I really hope that if there's a chance they ever try to revive the series again, they'll remember the example this one sets. I hope. But I'm glad to have been able to take another look at the series. Just kind of shows how far I've come as a gamer. Also as a person, I guess, which probably sounds funny, but I guess that's what happens when you wait a whole decade to revisit something you used to enjoy. I was satisfied. But the next time you see me, I think I'll take a look at something that feels old and new. But I won't say what that is yet. I'll see you when I see you though. Take care.